It operates with a budget whose CIA-specific total remains hidden from the public. It has helped overthrow governments, secretly dosed unwitting Americans with LSD, and spent years following the courier network that finally led to Osama bin Laden. This is how the CIA's greatest victories repeatedly produced the confidence behind its worst failures, and why attempts to restrain the agency were repeatedly followed by new crises that expanded its power again. The question is whether that cycle ever truly ended. The year is 1945. World War II is ending, and the United States has just discovered how little it actually knew about its enemies. The Wartime Office of Strategic Services, led by General William Donovan, had run sabotage missions and dropped agents behind enemy lines, but it was small, improvised, and deeply mistrusted by the military establishment, the State Department, and the FBI. Donovan wanted something permanent, a peacetime intelligence service that could gather information openly and covertly and guide the nation's strategic thinking. President Roosevelt considered the proposal, but died on April 12, 1945, nearly a month before Germany surrendered. His successor, Harry Truman, inherited a fractured intelligence system spread across competing departments that barely spoke to each other. Truman disbanded the OSS within months of the war ending, splitting its functions between the State Department and the War Department, an arrangement that satisfied no one. In January of 1946, Truman created the National Intelligence Authority and its operating arm, the Central Intelligence Group, an early attempt to centralize what remained a quarrelsome, overlapping system. It took another year and a half of political wrangling before Congress passed the National Security Act, which President Truman signed into law on July 26, 1947. The Central Intelligence Agency formally began operating that September. Its mandate was deliberately vague, to coordinate intelligence and perform other functions related to national security, as directed by a newly formed National Security Council. That vagueness gave the agency enormous latitude to grow far beyond simple analysis. Within a year, a National Security Council directive authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations abroad, actions designed so that American responsibility could always be denied. To carry them out, planners built the Office of Policy Coordination inside the agency. The office received direct policy guidance from the State and Defense Departments, while its chief formally reported to the CIA director. In practice, that unusual arrangement gave it extraordinary independence inside the agency, and for years its officers competed with the CIA's own intelligence branch for money, agents, and influence in the same overseas stations. The results, at first, were often humiliating. Soviet penetration compromised operations behind the Iron Curtain, sending freshly trained agents into traps, partly with the help of a British liaison officer secretly working for Moscow, Kim Philby. During the Korean War, the agency struggled with language expertise and leaned on field reporting that later proved fabricated. In China and Burma, failed operations and support for anti-communist forces drew the CYA into conflicts increasingly entangled with the region's opium economy, though the extent of the agency's own responsibility for that trade remains disputed among historians. But there was one early success that set a pattern for everything to come. In 1948, fearing that Italy's elections would hand power to the Communist Party, the agency secretly funneled money to Christian democratic politicians and anti-communist networks connected to the Vatican. The Christian Democrats won. It was covert, cheap by comparison to open war, and it worked. That lesson, that money and manipulation could reshape a nation's politics without a single soldier crossing a border, would define the agency for the next quarter century. Nowhere was that lesson applied more consequentially than in Iran. By 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, cutting Britain off from a resource it had controlled for decades. London, unable to act alone, turned to Washington. Under CIA Director Allen Dulles, the agency approved a plan codenamed Operation Ajax, run on the ground by Officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of a former president. Roosevelt spent CIA funds bribing parliamentarians and paying newspaper editors to publish stories branding Mossadegh a threat. The first attempt to remove him collapsed outright. A renewed campaign involving CIA and British covert action, Iranian military officers, paid political networks, and domestic opponents of Mossadegh ultimately succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah returned to the throne with American backing. The 1954 oil agreement that followed formally preserved Iranian ownership and granted Iran half of the consortium's net profits, though day-to-day operational control returned largely to a Western-dominated group of companies. In Langley, Operation Ajax was celebrated as proof the agency could reshape a nation from the shadows. It encouraged an even broader operation the following year in Guatemala, where a democratically elected government's land reforms had threatened the American-owned United Fruit Company. There, the agency combined psychological warfare, economic pressure, and paramilitary action to force out the sitting president. Both interventions worked in the short term. Both planted grievances that would echo for generations, and both convinced agency leadership that covert political engineering was now its core mission. But engineering coups required something the CIA still lacked: reliable eyes over closed societies. Conventional aircraft flying reconnaissance missions were being shot down with alarming regularity, so the agency partnered with the Air Force and Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division to build the U-2, a glider-like aircraft that could cruise above 70,000 feet. At first, it flew beyond the effective reach of Soviet fighters and most air defenses, photographing installations across the Soviet heartland in extraordinary detail. For years, it flew with near impunity. Then, in May of 1960, upgraded Soviet air defenses finally reached one deep inside Soviet territory, and pilot Gary Powers was captured alive. President Eisenhower's administration first denied the mission, then had to publicly admit the truth. Eisenhower later regretted the false cover story, even as he continued to defend the reconnaissance program itself. Even as its technical programs matured, the agency's political ambitions kept dragging it into disaster. In April of 1961, a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, intending to topple Fidel Castro. Promised air support never fully materialized. The invasion collapsed within days, and President Kennedy was left publicly humiliated, privately furious at the agency's leadership for assuring him of a victory it could not deliver. Rather than retreat, the CIA ran a sustained campaign of sabotage and paramilitary pressure against Castro's government for years afterward, tensions that helped set the stage for the nuclear standoff of the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, a much longer and darker chapter was unfolding. As America's commitment in Vietnam deepened through the 1960s, the agency ran a secret war in Laos and covert programs elsewhere in Indochina. Some of its regional allies were implicated in the opium trade, while allegations surrounding the use of CIA-linked aircraft in that trade remain disputed. Inside South Vietnam, the CIA organized the Phoenix Program, an intelligence and elimination campaign aimed at dismantling the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. Thousands of suspected operatives were captured, interrogated under brutal conditions, and killed. It weakened the enemy's underground networks, but it also became one of the most morally troubling chapters in the agency's history. At the very moment the agency was fighting communism abroad, it turned its methods inward. In April of 1953, newly appointed director Allen Dulles warned an audience at Princeton that the Soviets had developed sinister new techniques for what he called brain warfare. 3 days later, he personally approved the beginning of a program known as MK-Ultra, aimed at exploring behavior modification through hypnosis, electroshock, and psychoactive drugs, chiefly LSD, often on subjects who had no idea they were part of a defense research program. In one especially disturbing offshoot, codenamed Operation Midnight Climax, agency operatives set up observation posts behind two-way mirrors in rented houses, where sex workers lured unsuspecting men who were then secretly dosed with LSD so officers could study their reactions. A 1963 Inspector General's review curtailed the agency's secret testing on unwitting subjects, though related research continued under successor programs into the early 1970s. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most of the surviving records destroyed, which meant congressional investigators years later found only fragments of what had actually happened. Domestically, the agency also ran Operation Chaos, compiling files on roughly 7,200 Americans and pushing deep into domestic surveillance despite its statutory prohibition on exercising police, law enforcement, or internal security functions. All of this stayed hidden until the Watergate scandal cracked the agency's secrecy wide open. Former CIA officers were caught burglarizing Democratic Party headquarters, and President Nixon was recorded ordering aides to have the CIA pressure the FBI into dropping its investigation. When new CIA Director James Schlesinger discovered how much had been hidden even from him, he ordered every employee, in 1973, to report any activity that fell outside the agency's legal charter. The resulting internal document became known as the Family Jewels. Its contents stayed largely contained within government circles until December of 1974, when a New York Times investigation exposed the CIA's domestic spying to the public and forced Congress to act. The Church Committee investigations followed, and President Ford issued an executive order formally banning the assassination of foreign leaders. Reform did not mean restraint. In the 1980s, Washington backed two enormous covert wars simultaneously. In Afghanistan, the CIA funneled billions of dollars in weapons, including thousands of shoulder-fired Stinger missiles, through Pakistani intelligence to Mujahideen fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. In Central America, the agency had armed and trained Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras before Congress explicitly restricted further support. During the strictest period of those restrictions, members of the National Security Council staff built a private network to continue what the CIA itself was no longer legally permitted to do. American missiles were secretly sold to the Iranian government, ostensibly to help free hostages held in Lebanon, and the profits were diverted into that network to keep the Contras supplied. When journalists exposed the scheme in 1986, it became one of the defining scandals of the decade, forcing new legal restrictions on how covert action could be authorized and reported to Congress. Then, almost overnight, the enemy that had defined the agency's entire existence disappeared. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and with it went the CYA's clearest sense of purpose. Budgets shrank, stations closed, seasoned officers retired without replacement. Compounding the crisis, in 1994, longtime CIA officer Aldrich Ames was arrested for spying for Moscow, having spent years selling out American agents while sitting inside the agency's own counterintelligence division. Internal reviews found that some of the CIA's most important Cold War-era assessments had actually been built on Soviet disinformation, fed to American handlers by agents the agency itself had at times suspected of being compromised. Into this uncertain decade crept a new kind of threat. Osama bin Laden had participated independently in the broader anti-Soviet jihad of the 1980s, financed largely through separate Arab and Saudi channels. There is no evidence the CIA directly armed, funded, or recruited him. By the mid-90s, he was building a global terrorist network from Sudan and later Afghanistan. The agency created a dedicated unit to track him in 1996, but opportunities to strike were repeatedly passed over. Al-Qaeda's attacks grew bolder. The bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, then the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in the year 2000. Through the summer of 2001, senior officials received increasingly urgent warnings that Al-Qaeda was preparing something major. Director George Tenet later said the system was blinking red. What the intelligence community lacked was specific detail, a time, a target, a method, and no one successfully connected those strategic warnings to the scattered domestic leads already sitting inside different agencies. On September 11, 2001, that gap became catastrophic. Hijacked airliners struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and a fourth crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people died. Within days, CIA paramilitary officers were on the ground in Afghanistan, coordinating with anti-Taliban forces and calling in airstrikes that toppled the regime sheltering Al-Qaeda in a matter of weeks. But the same urgency that drove the Afghan campaign also produced one of the agency's costliest failures. In assessing Iraq's weapons programs, the CIA and the wider intelligence community relied on several weak or misinterpreted streams of evidence. Aluminum tubes said to be for centrifuges, claims about uranium purchases from Niger, and reports of mobile biological weapons laboratories. That last claim rested almost entirely on an Iraqi defector codenamed Curveball, whose reporting later proved fabricated. Separately, intelligence obtained through coercive interrogation helped reinforce false claims linking Iraq to Al-Qaeda. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 found none of the weapons stockpiles described beforehand. Later, official investigations described it as a major intelligence failure, one that dragged American forces into an insurgency with no clear front line. Out of that grinding, borderless conflict came a new kind of weapon, one built specifically for a war without fixed battlefields. The agency turned to remote aircraft, first for reconnaissance, then armed with precision missiles. The Predator, and later the larger Reaper, could loiter over a target for a full day, tracking movement through infrared sensors, while an operator sitting thousands of miles away watched every second. It let the CIA strike suspected militants in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia without risking an American life on the ground, but it also raised difficult new questions about accountability when a strike killed the wrong person. The most consequential use of that patient, technology-driven approach came in the hunt for bin Laden himself. For nearly a decade, he had vanished into Pakistan's tribal borderlands. The breakthrough came from years of painstaking work tracing one of his couriers, reinforced by other intelligence streams rather than any single lucky break, work that eventually led analysts to a fortified compound in the Pakistani town of Abbottabad. Confident but not certain it was him, the CIA coordinated with Navy Special Operations Forces for a raid deep inside Pakistani territory, without that government's knowledge. Late on May 1, 2011, American time, already May 2 in Pakistan, the raid ended with bin Laden's death, closing a hunt that had defined the agency's post-9/11 identity. In the years since, the CIA has kept adapting to a world that no longer resembles the one it was built for. It became an early investor, through its venture arm, in a Silicon Valley data analysis company called Palantir, whose software now helps analysts trace financial networks and hidden connections that once took months of fieldwork to uncover. Its focus has shifted towards cyber intelligence, renewed competition with Russia, and a long-term challenge from Beijing that combines economic scale, advanced surveillance, cyber capabilities, and rapid military modernization. Look back across nearly 8 decades, and the Central Intelligence Agency's story is really the story of American power itself. Improvised in crisis, expanded in secrecy, occasionally disgraced by its own excesses, and endlessly reshaped by the threats of each new era. Nearly every scandal forced new restrictions, and nearly every restriction was followed, a few years later, by a new crisis that expanded the agency's power right back. It has toppled governments and hunted the world's most dangerous men. It has also experimented on its own citizens and produced deeply flawed intelligence that helped lead its government into war. Both legacies belong to the same institution, and neither one fully explains it without the other. So which legacy has shaped the world more? The threats the CIA stopped, or the power it abused? Let me know what you think, and which intelligence service should be investigated next. Subscribe for more stories from inside the world's most secretive institutions.